The Hidden Holocaust, a genocide nearly twice to 3 times the size of Hitler's campaign to exterminate the Jews. Belgium's King Leopold II was responsible for the death of 10 to 15 million people from 1885 to 1908, in what is today known as the Democratic Republic of Congo.
In 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced, exiled, or forced to flee their homes. Hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed, and their inhabitants made refugees.
Now, the British ruling class was to blame for the deaths of up to 1 million people during the Great Famine in Ireland, and as many more were forced to emigrate because a foreign blight had turned the potato crop into rotten, stinking, putrefying mush.
This is how white Australians celebrated 150 years of settlement, which black Australians would describe as invasion.
Before Captain Phillip lands, Lieutenant Ball takes a boatload of Marines ashore to keep the natives in check.
It may be that this country will become the most valuable acquisition Britain has ever made.
Armenians were rounded up from towns and cities and forced to march across the Anatolian countryside through desert conditions. Up to 1.5 million people perished.
German anti-Nazis were the first victims. Their numbers swelled to include citizens of all the nations of Europe. Their fate is described by witness Rudolf Höss. I was in command at Auschwitz until December 1st, 1943, and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were exterminated there by gassing and burning. The rest of the victims were approximately 100,000 German Jews, and a great many citizens, mostly Jews, from Holland, France, Belgium, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and other countries.
Good evening, and of course it's Monday, so it's Red Line TV. Today we're going to be looking at the many Holocausts that there have been in human history, most of them, of course, totally undocumented, except, if at all, by the perpetrators. So that's one thing we really have to remember. But in the first of our 2 programs on this subject of liberating Holocaust, we're going to begin with the Jewish Holocaust. Program 2 will be following up, examining the other Holocausts throughout history. Now, there is a reason why we're doing it this way. We're devoting this first program to the Jewish Holocaust because no other genocide has a similar provenance in European history, in European culture, in European politics, in European thought. And we ask, how can we liberate the Jewish Holocaust to enable it to truly become part of the international struggle for human emancipation and solidarity with all of the oppressed? Now, in general, when we have these programs, we strongly believe in horizontal communication. The chat is on, as you know, and it's very important for us that that is so. But today, having so recently been attacked using our chat, we are turning the general chat off. You'll be able to communicate with the host directly, but not with each other. And I hope you understand that there are very good reasons for us doing this. Red Line is doing these series of programs because of our commitment to go where other people are afraid to go. We're not afraid, but we do need your support. Please consider supporting us through Patreon today and continue our essential work. Now, first of all, we're going to be hearing from Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein in 2021 was named as the 5th most influential political scientist in the world, and yet he can't get a permanent academic post. He was a student of Noam Chomsky. He's the child of Holocaust survivors, yet he's been vilified as a Holocaust denier. He describes himself as an old-fashioned communist, and in his controversial and insightful book, The Holocaust Industry, which I recommend people to read, by the way, He claims that the Nazi Holocaust enabled Israel, and this is in quotes, one of the world's most formidable military powers with a horrendous human rights record, to cast itself a state victim. Norman Finkelstein.
When I was growing up, the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, it literally did not exist in American consciousness. I did come from a family where both my parents were survivors. My father was in Auschwitz, my mother was in Majdanek. Every single family member on both sides was exterminated during the war. It was a great shame to be the son of Holocaust survivors back then, because the assumption was if you survived the Nazi Holocaust, you must have done something dirty. Or the assumption was that we went like sheep to the ovens. That was the other side of the shame. Jews were, at that point in time, in the 1950s and 60s, they were just then beginning to make it in American society. And so Jews were not looking back at how we suffered. No. Jews were looking forward. We're going to conquer American society because we are the best. Up until the mid-60s, there were only 2 scholarly studies on the Nazi Holocaust in the English language. 2. The estimate now is there are about 10,000. After World War II, the United States' main ally in Europe was West Germany. The German government consisted, aside from Adenauer at the top, it consisted mostly of former Nazi bureaucrats. If you brought up the Holocaust, you were seen as serving communist Soviet ends, because it was the communists and the Soviet Union who kept hammering away at these were the people who exterminated the Jews. That's America's ally. Jews who were now wanting to make it in the United States, the last thing they wanted to be seen as was aiding and abetting Soviet communist propaganda against the new German government. It was the McCarthy era. The obvious question then is, what changed? How did this Holocaust industry come into play? The answer is, oddly enough, Israel. From Israel's founding in 1947 until 1967, Israel didn't figure at all in American Jewish life, except as an object of charity. Occasionally you'd give money to grow a tree in Israel, but that was really about it. And I think the key turning point is the June 1967 war. Israel inflicts a major historical defeat on one of the U.S.'s major antagonists or adversaries on the world scene. The Middle East contains the most precious resource in the industrialized world, namely the oil. And the U.S. was controlling the region, except for, after World War II, the phenomenon of what came to be called radical Arab nationalism that had seized the distorted imagination of the Arab people that the resources beneath their feet belonged to them. And the person who embodied the phenomenon, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. As it came to pass, it wasn't the US or the British or the French that knocked off Nasser. It was the Israelis. Israel had done the deed. It had achieved a very significant victory. It had terminated the threat posed for more than a decade, from 1952 to 67, a 15-year threat posed by radical Arab nationalism. After 67, it was over. Israel became the U.S.'s strategic ally in the Middle East. Israel achieved what appeared to be a huge military victory, but it also now entered into an occupation. Israel acquired the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. All those territories were conquered during the 67 war. And the international community was not prepared to sanction the occupation. Israel was facing a problem. It was alienating the international community. And it then started to invoke the Nazi Holocaust. In particular, one claim, which became the kind of mantra of the Nazi Holocaust. The mantra was that the Nazi Holocaust was unique. And the uniqueness doctrine basically said that never before in the history of humanity has a crime been committed of the magnitude and of the quality of the Nazi Holocaust. If nobody in the history of humanity suffered the way Jews suffered, then ordinary standards of right and wrong shouldn't be applied to them. So whenever Israel was, and it was quite frequently given to the point of every minute of every day, to committing another atrocity, to committing another gross violation of international law, to committing another crime, war crime or crime against humanity, the standard refrain became, well, remember the Holocaust. And so the Nazi Holocaust became a kind of, not a kind of, it became an ideological weapon to delegitimize criticism of Israel, but it's all, at the end of the day, motivated by anti-Semitism. It then became a very convenient excuse for Israeli conduct, namely, it's not that we're doing anything wrong, it's that they claim we're doing things wrong because they hate Jews.
That's a hugely important contribution by Norman Finkelstein. I think the video is actually over 2 hours long, and just as well we couldn't get him on the show because he does tend to speak at length about the issue, and he is an expert on it, of course, and so he should speak at length. So we've edited it down to about 8 minutes, but it is both online in its full length, as well as we're going to put it up in the 8-minute version as well. We're going to talk about this uniqueness doctrine a little bit later with MOSHE ZUCKERMANN. But in the meantime, we want to speak to Graham Bash, formerly the editor of Labour Briefing and British Jew, about his experience of the Holocaust. Hi, Graham. Norman Finkelstein says that the Holocaust, which is quite surprising, he makes that point over and over again, actually, in the original speech. It might be quite surprising to people looking at history from today's point of view, where the Holocaust is so present in film and in culture, etc., as it should be, as well as other Holocausts, of course, but that in the US it didn't feature at all in the collective conscience either of Jews or the establishment. in the 50s and 60s. Was that a similar experience for Jews in Britain?
I can't speak for Jews in Britain, but it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't a common experience for me. I was very aware of the Holocaust from a very, very early age. I was born in 1949, brought up in the 50s, and the Holocaust was always part of our family discussion. It was part of the discourse even at school when children said to me that Hitler should have finished the job. So it was like it was part of the collective memory of post-war British Jews. So I have a totally different experience. Now, whether that's typical, I can't say, but it was certainly, I think that the discussions we had on the Holocaust were part of my politicization and part of the reason that in my late teens I became a political activist.
We have produced a video with you, which we're going to show in a minute now, about your recommended books on the Holocaust, and it's very interesting. You talk about collaborators, which were quite common. They were Jewish people collaborating. You also mention a book by Elie Wiesel, despite your criticisms of him. Do you want to say something on that a bit?
Let me answer both of those points. On Elie Wiesel, is a Zionist and, at that level, a political enemy. But if he says something of importance, of historical importance about the Holocaust, and I think his book Night does exactly that, then I think we should include that in any discussion. I'm not for cancel culture. He's got something important to say on that. He's got some less important things to say on other things, and we wouldn't discuss those on this program because it's not relevant to what we want to do. So, I mean, I've got no problem with that. I've forgotten your other question, Tina. What was it?
On collaborators.
Oh, look, of course there were Jewish collaborators, but the whole point that I think we're all going to make is we've got to stop particularizing, rather connecting and universalizing the experience. And there's collaborators in any act of oppression. Some sections, usually the elites, will collaborate with the oppression of their people. So too with the Jewish people. It's nothing particular. They were no worse, but they were no better either. But it's an important part of history that we have to record.
Thanks, Graham. We're going to show the video now of the book recommendations. We'll also put a bibliography online on our Patreon page and the website. So if you support us via Patreon, you will be seeing it before everybody else. And also the full text of Graham's speech is going to be available there. Here it is.
There are a number of outstanding books on the Jewish Holocaust. Elie Wiesel's Night, written by a young teenage Jew, a scholar of the Talmud, who with these poetic words announced the destruction of his faith.
Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never.
There is the most extraordinary work, Eyewitness Auschwitz, by Philip Müller, who worked in the crematoria for 2.5 years and survived. It is a heartbreaking, shattering story with a climax almost too unbearable to read, as the people from the family camp of Jews, seemingly under the protection of the Red Cross, who had been used for Nazi propaganda purposes, were sent to their deaths. This drove Müller to the edge.
I was determined to share my fate with my countrymen. I made my decision to die with them on the spur of the moment. Death was only minutes away. No memory, no trace of any of us would remain. Once more, people embraced. Parents were hugging their children so violently that it almost broke my heart. Suddenly, a few girls in the full bloom of youth came up to me. At last, one of them plucked up courage and spoke to me. We think your decision pointless. We must die, but you still have a chance to save your life. You have to return to the camp and tell everybody about our last hours. Perhaps you will survive this terrible tragedy, and then you must tell everybody what happened.
There is 5 notebooks from the Lodz ghetto by David Seriakowiak, written by a teenager who starved to death, as did so many others in the Lodz ghetto. In the face of starvation and illness, he maintains his dignity throughout, seized for forced labour on the way to school and jeered by bystanders. He writes, "It's our oppressors who should be ashamed, not us. Humiliation inflicted by force does not humiliate." He was 15. What wisdom. He describes how in the midst of this horror, he still found strength to do classes on Marxism and translated Lenin from Polish into Yiddish. And his stories of the leader of the Lodz Jewish Council, Chaim Rumkowski, are chilling. Following the Nazi call for deportations of children and old people, Rumkowski cooperated with the Nazis to the fullest extent, extolling the Jewish population of Lodz in these words:
"Fathers and mothers, give me your children. I must perform the difficult and bloody operation. I must cut off limbs in order to save the body itself. I must take children because if not, others may be taken as well."
Seriakowiak's hatred of the class oppression and division that thrived, even in the ghetto, is clear.
December 31st, 1942. Hunger is spreading in the ghetto, while the wealthy classes indulge themselves to the utmost. On the one hand, wealth, frolic and satisfaction. On the other hand, poverty, hunger and death. Old clogs and beautiful knee boots, warm apartments and wet, cold hovels. These are the symbols of the class structure in the ghetto.
Primo Levi's If This Is a Man is one of his many great works. The clue to the book is the title. A young Italian chemist, as a member of the anti-fascist resistance, is arrested and deported to Auschwitz.
After only a week in prison, the instinct for cleanliness disappeared in me. I wandered aimlessly around the washroom when suddenly I saw Steinloff scrub his neck and shoulders with little success. He has no soap, but great energy. He asked me severely why I do not wash. Why should I wash? Would I be better off? Would I live a day, an hour longer? We are all about to die. But Steinhoff interrupts me. He administers me a complete lesson that precisely because the lager was a great machine to reduce us to beasts, we must not become beasts. So we must certainly wash our faces without soap in filthy water and dry ourselves on our jackets. We must remain alive, not begin to die.
The Ghetto Fights, a memoir by Marek Edelman, member of the Warsaw Ghetto 5-person command team, gives the lie to the allegation that the Jews went to their deaths like lambs to the slaughter. Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil, is brilliant, controversial, profound, unsettling. It challenges the role played by the Jewish communal leadership. She suggests that had there been no Jewish organisations at all in the territories controlled by the Nazis, the deportations could not have run as smoothly as they did. And she wrote that the really terrifying thing about Eichmann was not that he was a monster, it's that he wasn't.
The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terrifyingly normal.
and then Rudolf Weber's masterpiece, I Cannot Forgive, alternatively entitled Escape from Auschwitz. It has all the attributes of the other books, but with an extraordinary punchline. The book starts with a visit of Heinrich Himmler to Auschwitz on July 17, 1942. Weber was still in his teens when he witnessed Himmler's visit and worked on the ramp where Jews arrived and were immediately selected for the gas chambers.
Far from satisfied with what he had seen, the gas chambers were no more than makeshift affairs. To a former teacher of mathematics, the whole business was just too haphazard. And so he gave the orders for the greatest, most efficient extermination factory the world has ever known. For the most modern concrete gas chambers and the vast crematoria that could absorb as many as 12,000 bodies in 24 hours, and in fact did so. There I worked for 8 months. I was determined to get out. I wanted to warn those yet to come what lay ahead, because I knew they would rise and fight, as the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto had fought.
There are stories of the capos, prisoners who supervised forced labour in return for privileges. They were both Jews and non-Jews. Many, perhaps most, were sadistic, brutal criminals. But not all of them. There was Franz.
As he shouted, he swung at us with his club. To the passing SS men, he looked and sounded a splendid capo, heartless, brutal, efficient. Yet never once did he hit us. In fact, all the time I knew him, I never saw him strike a prisoner. And that, in Auschwitz, was quite a record.
Weber could see the impending murder of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews. Against all odds, with heroism and huge amounts of luck, young teenager Rudolf Weber made his escape with Alfred Wetzler. And then the punchline. They gave their testimony to the Slovak Jewish Council. Weber warned them, 1 million Hungarians are going to die. If you tell them now, they will rebel. It was April 25th, 1944. The report reached Rudolf Kastner of the Budapest Aid and Rescue Committee, Hungarian Zionist based in Budapest, by 3rd May at the latest, but there was a huge delay. Weber claims that Kastner withheld the report in order not to jeopardize the negotiations with Eichmann that allowed 1,684 of Kastner's friends, family, fellow Zionists to leave for Switzerland, ultimately to Palestine in the Kastner train. The deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz began on 15th May at a rate of 12,000 a day. Most were killed immediately. Only on 6 July did the Hungarian head of state Horthy, under international pressure, cease the deportations. By then, deportations of over 434,000 had already occurred. Weber argued to the end of his life that but for the delay, deportees may have refused to board the trains, or that their panics would have disrupted the transports. In an interview conducted in Argentina in the 50s, Eichmann supported this view.
In Hungary, my basic orders were to ship all the Jews out of Hungary in as short a time as possible. They had sent me to make sure the Jews did not revolt as they had in the Warsaw Ghetto. In obedience to Himmler's directive, I now concentrated on negotiations with the Jewish political officials in Budapest. Among them was Dr. Rudolf Kastner, authorized representative of the Zionist movement. He agreed to help keep the Jews from resisting deportation and even keep order in the collection camps if I would close my eyes and let a few hundred or a few thousand young Jews emigrate illegally to Palestine. It was a good bargain. For keeping order in the camps, the price was not too high for me.
I remember when I was about 4, I wasn't yet at school. My childminder's father told me, always hate the Germans. I told my dad, and I'll always remember his reply. Never forget, son, the first victims of the Germans were the Germans themselves. He was referring, of course, to the German communists, socialists, and trade unionists. It was a lesson I've never forgotten.
Yeah, that was a very moving video, I thought. We've got a longer version on our website soon.
Indeed. Now we're kind of moving on to our next guest, and to introduce him, we've not only got me, we've also got a little snippet from a conference which I attended in 2018, when a number of German, Israeli, British, US academics, publicists, artists, and political activists met in Berlin, along with an audience of around 250, to discuss the instrumentalization of Jews, Judaism, and the Jewish catastrophe for the purpose of legitimating right-wing political power politics, anti-communism, historical revisionism, and anti-Muslim racism. I was invited, as I say, to speak in that conference, and it was my first real opportunity to begin to get my head around the German perspective, you know, the German response to the Nazi Holocaust. We were met with the police presence and some conversation around a rather strange political grouping that I still have trouble getting my head around, the Anti-Deutsche. It was there I met and shared a platform with our next guest, Professor MOSHE ZUCKERMANN. MOSHE ZUCKERMANN was born in 1949 in Tel Aviv. He's lived and worked in Germany as well as in Israel. Since 1990, he has been on the faculty of the Cohen Institute for History and Philosophy of Sciences and Ideas, and headed the Minerva Institute for German History at Tel Aviv University. His fields of research include the influence of the Holocaust on the political cultures of Israel and Germany. And this next trailer for the conference we went to, again, will be available as soon as possible on our website.
Sie nennen mich Verräter an meinem Volk. Sie nennen mich jüdischer Antisemit.
Israel, Zionismus, Juden, wird alles in einen Topf geworfen.
Die Angriffe auf meine Person, die sogar so weit gehen, dass mir vorgeworfen wird, ich sei überhaupt keine Jüdin.
Sie definieren als Deutsche, wer ein richtiger Jude ist und sein darf.
There are people who say Marx was an anti-Semite and who say communists are anti-Semitic.
Germany is using its support for Israel's ethnic cleansing and occupation and apartheid as a way to whitewash its soul.
Inzwischen hat sich eine Sicht auf den Islam herausgebildet, die sich in keiner Weise mehr von denen bei AfD, Neuer Rechter und selbst Nazis unterscheidet.
Welcome to MOSHE ZUCKERMANN, who's joined us. Jackie has given an introduction. I think that trailer looks so fascinating, and I think we're waiting still for some of the English translations, and then we're also publishing this on our YouTube channels and far and wide, because it looks like a really, really important conference. So thank you very much for joining us. I mean, just the trailer gives lots of food for thought on what's going on in Germany. I want to start by asking you about something that Norman Finkelstein brought up in his short video there, which is the uniqueness doctrine, which says there's nobody has ever suffered like the Jewish people did in the Jewish Holocaust, and probably nobody will suffer quite as much. There's certainly a logic there that sort of downgrades the suffering of people in other Holocausts, but it also links to something that Graham mentioned in his video, and that's something coming from Germany. You learn about the Holocaust. What you don't learn is that trade unionists, communists, socialists were the first victims in that campaign by Hitler. The first to be sent to the concentration camps. You learn about Sophie Scholl and her friends, resistance to the Holocaust and resistance to the Nazi regime. But the fact that capitalism turned to Hitler to smash the workers' movement is often ignored. Why do you think that is, if you agree with that assessment?
Well, why they're not talking about capitalism, it's quite clear, because capitalism won all over the world. It won in Europe, it won in Germany, and they will not criticize themselves. It's only left-wing people who would do that. So for the German culture, it's quite clear why they wouldn't talk about the affiliation of capitalism and Nazism. As far as the singularity or the uniqueness of the Holocaust goes, it depends whom you're talking to. You're talking to Jews, for them is, of course, the Holocaust singular. You're talking to Japanese, for them, Hiroshima and Nagasaki is unique. You're talking to Chinese people, the infiltration of Chinese by the Japanese is a unique thing. Talk to Black people, you talk about slavery. Every collective in the world has, of course, its unique Holocaust or national catastrophe. I think that the only thing that you can say in what way was the Holocaust unique was that it was a big surprise that especially in the enlightened continent as it saw itself, Europe with a tradition of Aufklärung, of enlightenment and so on, that in the most enlightened of all countries, if they saw themselves being Germany, then there could happen what happened, and happened in a way that was unique to modernity. This, I think, is the special thing about the Holocaust, that it was an industrialized form of extermination of collective. It was bureaucratically conducted, and it was in an administrative way managed. This was, I think, in a way unique. You can compare in that respect. You can compare the Holocaust of the Armenians during First World War with that. But these are only external attributes of the catastrophe. But if you want to have it analytically, this is why they talk about the singularity of the Holocaust.
And you studied this issue. How has the perception of the Holocaust changed over time in Germany? Norman was telling us how it's changed in America, especially with the government in West Germany, as Norman pointed out, was run by former Nazis usually, and the fact that was only pointed out by communists or socialists in Germany. How has this perception changed over time?
It started with Nazis. It's not true that all the last 70 years Germany was ruled by Nazis. I mean, Angela Merkel was not a Nazi. Gerhard Schröder was not a Nazi. I mean, let's put things into perspective. It's true that because Germany had to become an ally of the Western bloc against communism, they needed Germany to become all of the sudden, a democratic state. There has been yesterday Nazis, and the next day they have to become Democrats. And in that respect, of course, they didn't have any other possibility. All the people, all the elites that you have in the Nazis were drawn into the old federal republic, in the economic elite, the academic elite sometimes, the political elite sometimes, and so on. So this is why you could talk about that Nazis ruled Germany at the beginning. I think what changed over the years is the fact that it is quite surprising to see how, while in the perspective of time, sometimes memory is fading, it is becoming more, something which you start to forget. In Germany, it was because of what they called Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, the confrontation of the past. It became a kind of fetish to confront their past, which was a good thing at the beginning, but it became then a fetish. And this fetish turned all the time to things that has nothing whatsoever to do with the political outlook of the government. It couldn't be a social democratic government or a Christian democratic government. They all are seeing that what Merkel said in 2008 at the Knesset in Israel, that Israel's security is the raison of the German state, which is, of course, a complete idiotic thing to say. But, and this is an important thing, I think that that has to do with one thing that was from the beginning there, and that became ever more a major topic, that they cannot distinguish between Judaism, Zionism, and Israel, and putting it negatively between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the critique of Israel. They are not able to do it. You say Jew in Germany, and they are blushing all the blood. They're becoming, paralyzed, because the mere concept of Jew is something that is lying on their soul. In that respect, I don't think that's all that much changed as far as the content of the relationship to the Jew is pertained. But I think that quite on the contrary, the things had become even stronger because of some of the groups, and as I see it, not some of the groups. We will talk in a minute about the Anti-Deutsche to understand why the Anti-Deutsche are only a separate groups which are in big correlation to the big German politics, to the big German media, to the Israeli influence on the Jewish communities in Germany, and these Anti-Deutsche. This constellation, I've written about it in a book published in 2018. This constellation is what is really building a hermetic matrix that you cannot break anymore. You're not able to talk. This is what Jackie and I were experiencing at this conference, Time of the Slanderers. You are really not able, you are powerless because of this big front that you have to break, and you cannot do it. Not at the moment, and I don't know how long it will take until you can do it.
I mean, growing up in Germany, the concept of Kollektivschuld is very, very strong in Germany. It's perhaps difficult to, well, probably not that difficult to understand for British people, but it just means, we're all collectively guilty. There was no real resistance, etc. You get, the Holocaust is a huge part of the education system. And with it comes, of course, the question of you're not allowed to criticize Israel, because that means you deny responsibility for what the Nazis did. And this is very, very closely linked in Germany. And perhaps we will talk about that later as well as a little bit, but the stronger the Palestine solidarity movement became, the stronger perhaps became the counter-reaction. And I see the rise of the anti-Germans, anti-Deutsche, a part of that. I was already out of the country when they started rising, but it is a very, very weird development. Just for people who've not been familiar with them, they're called anti-Germans, and they basically say you cannot ever criticize Israel, and they proclaim to be from the left, of the left, and some of them probably are. but it's turned into a very, very strange movement. So can you talk a little bit about more how they are linked together with efforts by the German government as well to criminalize BDS? I mean, we should mention at this point perhaps that in 2019 the German parliament voted that the BDS movement is anti-Semitic. There was a vote taken in the German parliament to confirm that.
I just would like to correct one thing that you said at the beginning. I think the concept of Kollektivschuld was confronted even in the 50s by Karl Jaspers to say there is nothing like Kollektivschuld. The question is whether people still felt guilty, and nowadays it changed. It's not to be guilty, but to take responsibility in a removed way. Now, as far as the anti-Deutsche goes, this is really something that if it was not so sad, it was really a caricature of a political development. It started with a collapse of the Soviet Union and of Soviet communism, when a group of Germans who saw themselves opposing Germany, being anti-German, and they called themselves Anti-Deutsche Kommunisten, meaning anti-German communists, proclaiming that they don't want any influence of Germany in the future to be the major influence on Europe and the world, because Germany has caused so much catastrophes in 20th century. Now, there were communists, and then the Soviet communism collapsed, and all of a sudden there were anti-German, but without communism. What could they do? So they asked themselves, in what respect can I be anti-German? Oh, I can be anti-German because German has caused the Holocaust to the Jews, so I'm going to identify with the Jews. This was the turning point of being anti-German communist into being anti-German per se, identifying and solidarizing with the Jews. And because the Jews have established themselves nationally in Israel, they became the big fans of Israel. And because Israel is in conflict with the Palestinians, they became, of course, the big enemies of the Palestinians. And being the Palestinians the strongholders of Islam, they became anti-Islamistic. And because the United States fought the Islam in the beginning of the 2000, the war against Iraq and so on, they became all of a sudden pro-American, pro-US, and because the US is the strongholder of capitalism, they became all of a sudden anti-Deutsche, pro-American, and big favor of capitalism. So beginning with anti-German communists, this ended up to be pro-Israeli and pro-Jewish and pro-Zionistic, of course, fans of America and American capitalism. I'm saying that because they are a caricature. If they were not very influential in major part of German media, in the middle ranges today, and if they were not in big correlation to, first of all, the major German politics starting from 1952, when there were the Wiedergutmachungsabkommen, so the reparation agreements, it was clear. Israel is ready to be paid by the Germans for what the Germans has caused to the Jews, and Israel and part of the deal was that Germany would never criticize Israel. The major person to proclaim it, he was one of the most influential media people, Axel Springer. One of his essentials in the Bild-Zeitung was, first of all, we are democratic. Secondly, never criticize Israel. You have to understand that in the 60s, he owned some 40% of German media, printed media, and later on other media. Another component was, except of the German politics and the media, was, of course, the growing influence of the Jewish communities in Germany, because in the 50s and 60s, they didn't want to make any waves. They didn't want to expose themselves because they saw themselves sitting on the suitcases because there was no future for Jews in Germany. This turned and changed in the end of the 80s with Ignaz Bubis, whom you probably know, said Jewish communities should flourish again in Germany. And then they became, all of a sudden, they became, really a moral instance in Germany. It's enough for a Jewish community to say that the documenta, now the documenta that is going to open in 2 days is anti-Semitic. And in order to, to incite a major discussion in Germany, every minor problem is becoming a big issue the moment that Israel, Zionism, and anti-Semitism, so-called anti-Semitism, is involved. So I think the problem is not only the anti-Deutsche, but the whole constellation of major politics, the media, Jewish communities, which are influenced by the Israel Foreign Ministry, by the way, and of course the anti-Deutsche, who are now not very prominent or not very visible anymore.
Clearly, you in Germany have gone through exactly the same thing that the left in Britain went through with the during the Corbyn years, and it's still going on. I mean, it's spreading in universities, schools, etc. Free speech is under huge attack, etc. Do you think it has something to do with the pro-Palestine movement becoming stronger? So the stronger that becomes, the stronger the argument against it, and the stronger the attacks and calling it anti-Semitic. Are they getting stronger in Germany, the pro-Palestine?
I would like to think so, but it's not true, because I think that the Palestine movement in Germany is becoming ever weaker from month to month, from year to year. I mean, I'm cooperating with them, I'm working with them and so on, but I see how poor they are, in the public sphere of Germany. It's not true that they become stronger. And by the way, it's not true that they become stronger on the world stage. In Israel, nobody talks anymore about occupation. I mean, we have a right-wing and extremist right-wing government, which, by the way, today is dissolved. I don't know whether you know, there are going to be new elections in Israel, which will probably bring Netanyahu back, which is our next catastrophe. But what I'm talking about is that I think that what was very strong some 15, 20 years ago has become very, very weak in the last years. The Palestinians are not as strong as you think. They are only on the symbolic level. BDS is symbolic level. BDS has no effect, no real effect on Israel's economy or Israel's standing in the world. And this is part of the thing that we don't understand, that the way that we try to boycott Israel because of being an apartheid state is not the same situation as with South Africa in the 70s and 80s. Because while there was a consensus in the world against South Africa, there is not a consensus in the world against Israel and against Zionism, against the occupation. Quite on the contrary, I think that whether it was Trump or it was Obama, never would the US try even to think to abandon Israel. It is a stronghold of American expansionist and imperialist politics in our region. So in that respect, I don't think that the Palestinian case is becoming stronger. I'm afraid it's quite the contrary.
That's interesting. You said it. I think perhaps it's slightly different in Britain. I mean, the big demonstrations tend to be around issues of Palestine, and you get tens of thousands of people.
Not in Germany. Not in Germany.
That is interesting. Okay, we can also now bring in Tony Greenstein now, perhaps, Jackie, shall we?
Yeah, let's do that. Can I just say though that I think it's really interesting as we're talking. we have to mention that we were going to have a Palestinian speaker, but unfortunately she wasn't well. And I think what is being asked of the Palestinian people is that they actually pay the price for the Nazi Holocaust. Not Germans really are not paying the price for this, and certainly not the Europeans and Americans who refuse to have Jewish refugees come in or to actually intervene decently at any early stage. But it's the Palestinian people who are being asked to pay for these crimes. And I was very appreciative, Moshe, of your comment that each group sees their genocide as particular and having definite characteristics, because I know, as a descendant of people who've experienced at least two major events of Holocaust genocide, that each of those have their particularities. So we're not, I'm afraid, going to have a Palestinian, but we are going to talk now to Tony Greenstein and hopefully attempt to bring some kind of Palestinian perspective in. For those who don't know Tony Greenstein was, as he always likes to remind me, the first Jewish person to be expelled from the Labour Party during the false anti-Semitism campaign. He's a very well-known anti-Zionist blogger, followed by tens of thousands regularly. He's also the author of a history of fighting fascism in Brighton and on the South Coast, and he's currently bringing out a book on Zionism during the Holocaust. So Tony, I'm going to start with some questions that I was going to put actually to Garda Kami, who unfortunately can't make it tonight. Now we're seeing across the world, aren't we, the adoption of this supposed gold standard of the IHRA, which in fact is a very poor definition of anti-Semitism, but it is being adopted by many governments. How much pressure do you think this has put on not just Palestinians, but those who advocate for Palestinian rights?
Well, the point about the IHRA is that it's not a definition of anti-Semitism. It's a definition, if you like, it's a redefinition of anti-Semitism, and it's a redefinition of anti-Semitism in terms of opposition to the Israeli state and Zionism. In essence, the Palestinians have become the new Nazis. I mean, we saw that with Netanyahu's address, I think it was to the 2016 World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem, where he said that Hitler only got his idea of exterminating the Jews from the Grand Mufti. I mean, historically, he was flayed, as it were, for that, because it was simply not true. The Mufti only met Hitler in November 1941, when the Holocaust had already begun. It had begun with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941. Chelmno had already, the first extermination camp had already been set up. So it was absolutely absurd. But this is the Zionist narrative. And of course, in terms of Germany, the German state has expiated its guilt. It has atoned, if you like, for its participation in the Holocaust by transferring that guilt onto the shoulders of the Palestinians. That's really what we have to understand.
Very interestingly, Tony, I noticed that at a commemoration march for the Nakba in Germany, the German officials would not allow the Palestinian flag to be flown, which is exactly what we see happening in Israel. Now, the idea that you have a European state that doesn't allow a flag to be flown is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, of course, but it's part and parcel of that, because the Holocaust has, if you like, been weaponized as part of an imperialist narrative. I mean, the Holocaust has become almost the justification for the atrocities of Western imperialism. And they've done that by taking it out of history. I mean, this is the whole point about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, that what it says is the Holocaust is not part of history. The Holocaust occurred not because of German fascism, not because of the rise of Nazism, because the Jews were Jews. Anti-Semitism has always existed. It's not susceptible to historical forces. People don't see that the Jews played their part in history. They were oppressors and they were oppressed at different times.
Be careful, Tony. Be very, very careful of saying that. I remember somebody else who once had the audacity to actually point out that Jews haven't always consistently played the roles of the oppressed.
Well, yes, of course, because as Abraham Leon, who was the leader of the Belgian Trotskyists and himself died in Auschwitz, said Zionism saves itself the trouble of understanding anti-Semitism by positing it to the whole of history. It doesn't understand it and it doesn't want to understand it. Because if anti-Semitism is eternal and inherent in society simply because the Jews are there, then of course the only answer is to form a Jewish state, because Jews cannot live with non-Jews. So Zionism adopted the anti-Semites narrative throughout.
Absolutely. And can I just say, what's also worrying, of course, is the way certain sections of the left in the UK adopted it with such alacrity. And I'm thinking in particular of Owen Jones and his statement about, and it's extraordinary for a socialist to say this, because I want everybody to think of what the consequences of this thought would be, that anti-Semitism is like a cancer. In other words, anti-Semitism has no material root at all. It is there. It is always there. It will always pop out whatever we do. That's what it means. There is no cure for it. There is nothing we can ever do.
Yeah,
I mean, if we actually believe that, why are we socialists at all?
Yes, I mean, Leon Pinsker, who was one of the very first Zionists, he predated Herzl, said anti-Semitism is a mental disease. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it's incurable. Now, of course, if the disease is incurable, you can't fight it. You can at best treat it as a palliative, but you can't do anything about it. And this is the Zionist argument, of course, that anti-Semitism is not a product of the society in which it emerges. And that's very clear. But can I just say about the Holocaust itself? Yeah. People talk about the Holocaust and they think of Germany automatically. The Holocaust didn't just occur because of Germany. There was a Holocaust of 300,000 Jews, the second highest, in Romania, for example, which had precious little to do with the Nazis. The Nazis did not take part in it. There was Croatia. Croatia had its own extermination camp, the only country under Nazi occupation, Jasenovac, and it had a whole number of branches as well. They carried out extermination, not only against the Jews, of course, but the Serbs, Muslims, and Gypsies. So you again have to put that into a context.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is turn to another subject, and perhaps Moshe Zuckermann could have some comments with this. This notion of left anti-Semitism, left, or what is now called, they don't like calling it left anti-Semitism anymore. They're moving on to the next stage and they call it the new anti-Semitism. What's it about?
Look, I have to comment on the concept. What I understand being a leftist, that you cannot be a leftist and anti-Semitic. I mean, it's not possible. It's a contradiction in term. You cannot be anti-Semitic and a leftist. The fact that they created this concept had, of course, tactical, political, and ideological intentions, which worked, by the way, because more than fighting anti-Semitism, and fighting leftists in Germany and in Israel, they exterminated, the whole leftist movement. It has become a curse. Netanyahu really managed to bring up the the notion of being leftist as being, you know, a little bit of pathological disease. So in that respect, I think that asking about leftist anti-Semitism is, to me, a contradiction in term. But how do you fight people who think in these terms, and you cannot you are not able to discuss with them rationally? By the way, the notion that there is no cure against anti-Semitism has not been invented nowadays. You know, the big German historian Mommsen at the end of the 19th century said, you cannot fight anti-Semitism because it's not rational. You cannot find it rationally. You can hope that it will pass, but you cannot fight it as a matter of fact. And its root is, of course, not the modern anti-Semitism, but, you know, the roots are the anti-Judaism, which had begun in Christianity, because, you know, Jews being the murderers of God. If they are the murderers of God, I mean, what can be more awful than that?
Ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the reasons, however, why it worked was, let's be straightforward about this. The establishment wanted it to work. We see now, basically, across the European, American world, a kind of a definite sway towards the right. The right at the moment are really having their day. And it suits them extremely well, even though they can't point to one case in which a leftist has attacked a Jew, has gone into a synagogue and gunned people down. Nothing like that can be chosen. But one of the reasons it works is because it suits the establishment. I think what concerns me is people on the left. I don't know what's happened in Germany, but this is still a live thing now. People on the left actually believing this tosh, this total, utter nonsense. Tony, what can we do about it?
Well, firstly, the reason for that is because of the collapse of so much of the left into identity politics, so that any minority, Jews or whoever, are the equivalent of any other group. Even though Jews today, you know, I mean, it was said, I think Norman Finkelstein said it, that the further away from the Holocaust, the less oppressed Jews are, the more they were concerned about anti-Semitism. At the very time anti-Semitism was disappearing, it became a greater and greater issue. And that is, of course, the irony that we face. So I mean, it's a weaponization of the Holocaust, but we see the irony is today, the most ardent anti-Semites are also the most ardent supporters of the Israeli state. I mean, you mentioned the German Bundestag, which condemned BDS as anti-Semitic, but the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, wanted to go further. It actually wanted to make BDS illegal, and the AfD is riddled with neo-Nazis. Or you have, I mean, actually Richard Spencer, who's the neo-Nazi founder of the alt-right in America, praised Trump for the Holocaust Memorial Day commemorations because he hadn't mentioned Jews, and he said that the Holocaust needs to be de-Judified. And in a sense, he's right. The Holocaust, as it's now commemorated, has actually very little to do with Jews. And if you look at Israel today, there are 3 days in the year when they commemorate the Holocaust. But for the rest of the year, they forget about the people who are actually still living in Israel, who are Holocaust survivors. 1/3 to 1/2 of them are living in absolute abject poverty in a state which spends the second highest proportion of its GDP on weapons, on its arms budget. So that the Holocaust is not actually about the Jews who died in the Holocaust. It's a narrative which is completely separated from it. And as Haaretz put it in its front page article, Israel is waiting for its Holocaust survivors to die because it will be able to save all those welfare benefits which it's currently paying. I should add, Germany paid Israel very large sums, billions of marks in reparation, and Israel has just stolen it from them. I mean, it's quite blatant in what it's done. they're condemned to a life of poverty in order that Israel can become a super military state.
That's what it's about, really, isn't it? It's about imperialism. I'll bring you in a second, Moshe. I was going to ask you, it's about not criticizing imperialism's plans, isn't it? And Israel is very much an important ally of the US imperialism and has, of course, its own program, etc., but is very much linked with US imperialism. And there's an attempt to redefine anti-Semitism as, any criticism of Israel, but also any criticism of what capitalism is doing. Now, we're seeing an attempt to call anti-capitalism anti-Semitic per definition, which is hugely important, which I think has a lot to do with the crisis of capitalism where we're going. You are one of the signatories of the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism as an alternative to the IRA definition. Do you see, is that part of a fight back? Could that be part of a global attempt to redefine again and take it out of the hands of the Zionists to describe what anti-Semitism is?
You know, Tina, there was a time when I was asked about are there no more people like you and Gideon Levy and Amira Haas and all the people who are criticizing Israel in that respect? And I think, yes, we are always meeting on Thursdays in a telephone cell. Meaning, we're talking about when you're talking about the people, the 280 intellectuals who signed the Jerusalem Declaration, we are a minority. We have no influence. I mean, the HIRA definition has been adopted by major countries in the world. Nobody adopted our redefinition, which was only a modification to say you have to fight anti-Semitism, of course, but don't tell us that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. This was, the major contribution of the Jerusalem Declaration. But the problem is that we are not influential. I mean, we're talking, we are entre nous, so to speak. Everybody is here leftist, so we are very proud about being together here. But, looking at the larger scale, I'm saying it not trying to withhold our fights, which we have to do, but we are not influential at the moment. In Israel was in 2011 a major protest demonstration against the economic situation in Israel. It turned out to be the demonstration of the middle class. And you know what? During 3 months where the major avenues and allies in Tel Aviv were occupied by tents in which protesters against the economic situation were active, with demonstrations and with the lectures and so on and so on. There were 2 topics you could not talk about. You know what? 400,000 people went on the streets. There were 2 topics you could not talk about. You could not talk about the occupation because they didn't want to be political. And the second thing you couldn't talk about was about capitalism, just to ask why the middle class is even struggling to, overcome the difficulties, whether it has something to do with capitalism. No. Don't talk with us about capitalism, not about occupation. Sure enough, after 3 months, the question whether it will, how it will end this demonstration was, when will the first train come to Tel Aviv? And the first train came just in time for the people to dissolve, and all of the movement was over. So what I'm trying to say is, even though we could, of course, see the connection to criticism of capitalism being anti-Semitic, this notion about which I think everybody of us have lectured and written articles and books and so on, we are not very influential in that. Talk about capitalism. With whom do you want to talk about capitalism nowadays? Who understands the notion? I remember giving a lecture. I was asked in Tel Aviv during a conference to talk about how would Marx or even the Frankfurt School react to the situation in Israel. And I gave them an all, accord about the capitalism and the criticism of capitalism and so on. And what was the reaction of the first professor to react to me? There is no capitalism in the world. Now, the moment that a very prominent professor, I mean, he's a little bit old, so maybe there are some mental problems there. The first to begin his comment with "there is no capitalism in the world" is, of course, for me something that is indicative about what is the field, what are the stage we are playing in, and we are to talk about capitalism. I have given for 30 years my Marx seminars in the university. That was good for my students. It was not very influential in the Israeli political discourse.
Okay, I'm going to finally bring back Tony, really. And I also want us to consider, or maybe Tony and then Graham can think about the consequences of the way that the Nazi Holocaust has been used, particularly for other minorities, as well for Jews. I have to say, Moshe, I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are. It may be because what I see in the UK actually is a civil society that sees this and perceives this quite clearly. And if anything, since what's happened with Corbyn, are very much more clear about the place that Zionism takes politically. Anyway, Tony, what comments would you have?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in Britain, and not just in Britain, the narrative of the Palestinians and about Israel has largely been won amongst ordinary people. The fact that we've had all these human rights reports from Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, etc., all of them saying that Israel is an apartheid state. And then we see on our TV thousands of settlers chanting what? Death to the Arabs in Jerusalem just less than a month ago. The IHRA says if you make a comparison with the Nazis in Israel, that's anti-Semitic. Well, I'm afraid it's true, isn't it? Because what was the favourite slogan of the anti-Semites in Poland and Germany? Death to the Jews. And in the time of Dreyfus as well. How can you not make such a comparison? There are so many comparisons. It's totally absurd to try and outlaw it. And of course, it's part of the overall political dialogue that we have, that comparisons with the Nazis, Saddam Hussein was the new Hitler. Gamal Abdel Nasser was the new Hitler. Yasser Arafat was the new Hitler. So the Zionists can make these comparisons, but we can't. People see through it because, the problem for the IHRA is that most people do understand what anti-Semitism is. Yeah. If you don't like someone because they're Jewish, that's anti-Semitic. The man or woman on the Clapham omnibus has no difficulty in understanding what anti-Semitism is. You have to go through these political and verbal gymnastics in order to come up with a definition which isn't about anti-Semitism. So, all the worst anti-Semites today are pro-Zionist. In fact, they always were. Anti-Semitism always supported Zionism because it was a way of getting rid of the Jews in your midst. And the Zionists knew that. So it was a devil's alliance, if you like, a Faustian pact. And that hasn't changed today at all. If someone is a genuine anti-Semite, they're also a genuine Zionist.
Okay, Graham, what do you have any comments you'd like to say at this point? You're muted.
Yeah, well, thank you, comrades. What a rich discussion. I suppose we go back to the title of these programs, Liberating the Holocaust. So how do we do it? How do we separate the narrative of the Holocaust, the memory of the Holocaust, from the interests of the Israeli state? And I suppose the answer is in difficult conditions, but not impossible conditions, to make the connections, to make the connection between the suffering of the Jewish people and all those other victims of the Nazis, between the Jewish Holocaust and all the other Holocausts that we're going to be discussing. Because I started off by saying that the Jewish Holocaust was part of the collective memory of post-war Jewish people, certainly in Britain. And it's got to become much more than that. I think it's by making these connections, by universalizing it, not particularizing it, it's got to be part of the collective memory, all these Holocausts, of the whole of humanity, as we build a global resistance in our fight for human liberation, for global revolution. It's easier said than done, and I know that we are on the back foot, both in Britain, Europe, and in the world. But we have to fight, we have to connect, we have to resist, because we have no alternative. So I think it's been actually a rich discussion, making connections. Obviously, we've got to do more than that. We've got to deepen this discussion, but it's a very good starting point, in my opinion.
I also say that the Nazi Holocaust wasn't just the Jewish Holocaust. The disabled, arguably, were the first victims of the Holocaust. The Gypsies, I mean, Yisrael Gutman, one of the major historians, Zionist historians.
The homosexuals.
The homosexuals, yes.
Actually, we've got another program.
The Gypsies.
We've actually got another program
Sorry.
when we're going to be doing that. But Tina, you...
I was just going to say, I mean, in addition to, connecting or pointing out that, there were other Holocausts and people have, in the strive for power and in the rise of one system going down, another one rising, genocides were quite common in our history, etc. But what's important is how we fight back. And I know Moshe is, a bit pessimistic, etc. And I think the situation in Germany, for various reasons, historical reasons, is
Tina, I'm more optimistic now after I've heard you. So
oh my God, I was going to say that. I think it's really what we're doing here, and beyond that is really, really important to actually fight back collectively. And you're saying only 280 intellectuals signed that declaration. But everybody knows everybody on the left kind of knows about it internationally. Small seeds, can turn into something quite important. And I love that story by Lenin, who said a few weeks before the Russian Revolution broke out, he said, it's a shame, I probably won't be alive to see the Russian Revolution. And then, bam, it happened. It's probably unlikely to happen soon, but we know we must connect internationally, work together and exchange and, also make each other more optimistic about the future.
Because it's another thing that's coming, which we mustn't forget. And this is why we have to keep fighting. And this is partly why we know it's going to change. There are forces that are bigger than our opponents and bigger than us, which are going to change the world. And I include in that global warming. And it's either fight to change the world or the end of the world. And I insist on staying an optimist because I have children and grandchildren, and I love the world. So in our next show, we're going to be looking at the indigenous people of the Americas, of Australia, of New Zealand. We're going to be looking at the Irish and the Bengali famine, orchestrated, of course, by the British ruling class, and not to forget the African Holocaust, which all of these things, we talk about so little. Where are the centres to commemorate this? They are nowhere. And why are they nowhere in this country? Because Britain profited hugely from the mass killings of people across the globe. It's much more convenient for the British establishment to commemorate the Nazi Holocaust because they can be the heroes. Well, next week, when we look at the position of, for example, the Romani people who are still waiting after decades of lobbying Holocaust Memorial Day to be allowed to have a place on the executive of that board, we are going to be talking to a representative from those people and asking again the real questions. What is the function of genocides and Holocaust? Who profits from them? Where do we go with it? And what's the meaning for the left? And good night to everybody. And the struggle continues. Thank you to our guests and thank you for coming. Good night.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.